July 1st, 1898, the middle of the Spanish-American War. On the San Juan Heights near Santiago in eastern Cuba, American volunteers from the Rough Riders are storming Spanish defensive positions. Leading the charge is the 39-year-old Theodore Roosevelt. The assault is a complete success. Soon after, the Spanish garrison on the island capitulates, and Madrid is forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty. The Spanish colonial empire collapses. Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba fall under American control. 3 years later, the hero of San Juan Hill, Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, becomes President of the United States, and he will revolutionize American foreign policy. Roosevelt reinterprets the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. What began as an attempt to keep European colonial powers out of Latin America is transformed into a justification for American hegemony across the region. The symbol of that hegemony becomes big stick diplomacy, a doctrine that legitimizes the use of force to protect American interests, providing the ideological foundation for repeated military interventions and for treating the Caribbean as America's, quote, inner lake. Now, more than 120 years later, President Trump is not only returning to the Monroe Doctrine and the politics of the big stick, he's trying to reinterpret them once again, in an even more radical form, as the ideological basis for a new era of American dominance over the Western Hemisphere. The first step toward that new dominance has already been taken. On January 3rd, President Maduro was abducted by American Special Services, and Venezuela was brought back into the American sphere of influence. Now, dark clouds are gathering over Cuba, the next target of President Trump. US Navy warships are assembling around the island. American spy planes are conducting reconnaissance along the Cuban coast, and a new generation of Rough Riders is preparing to plant the American flag over the San Juan Heights once again. Venezuela brought into the American sphere of influence. US Navy warships surrounding Cuba, a new chapter of the Monroe Doctrine. The United States is rewriting the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere before our eyes. Geopolitical shifts like these have a way of ending up in your portfolio, whether you are paying attention or not. I have been trying to stay ahead of these changes for years, rather than wait to be caught off guard, which is exactly why I use XTB, the partner of this channel and a place where I manage my own investments. The platform gives me access to over 8,800 stocks and ETFs from around the world, including companies across the energy, tech and industrial sectors, and I can invest commission-free on up to 100,000 euros in monthly turnover. Just keep in mind that all investing carries risk. To understand why Cuba has become Donald Trump's next target, we need to go back to January 3rd this year. On that day, the Americans abducted Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, and power in Caracas passed to Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. As quickly became clear, Rodriguez had been brought into the American plans in advance, and had agreed to cooperate. In this way, Venezuela was de facto brought into the American sphere of influence. The events in Caracas reverberated loudly in Havana, 2,000 kilometers away. Venezuela had been Cuba's largest energy supplier. Every month, regular shipments of oil arrived on the island from Venezuela, covering around 50% of Cuba's energy needs. With Maduro removed, that source dried up. Behind this, of course, stood the Americans, who concluded that cutting Cuba off from Venezuelan oil would trigger an energy crisis on the island and bring down a regime that had been a thorn in America's side since New Year's Eve 1959, when Fidel Castro's forces entered Havana. Already on January 11th, Trump declared, "There will be no more oil or money going to Cuba. Zero. I strongly suggest Cubans make a deal, before it is too late. The escalation against Cuba was therefore a natural consequence of the success the Trump administration had achieved in Venezuela. But there are two other factors that also play an important role. The first is the figure of US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Rubio is the son of Cuban immigrants. Although his parents left Cuba not for political reasons, but economic ones, and arrived in the United States 3 years before Fidel Castro's revolution, Rubio built his political career around the idea of overthrowing the communist regime in Cuba. This is hardly surprising since Florida, the state Rubio comes from, is the main home of the Cuban diaspora. Since entering the world of high politics, Rubio has consistently blocked every attempt to normalize relations with Cuba. Now, as the head of the powerful State Department, he has a chance to bring his crusade to an end. All the more so because Rubio's policy fits perfectly into the president's strategic vision, one the press has dubbed the Monroe Doctrine. It is a radicalized version of the Monroe Doctrine, drawing heavily on Theodore Roosevelt's Big Stick policy, which we mentioned at the beginning. Trump is deeply convinced that the United States should dominate the Western Hemisphere economically, politically, and if necessarily, militarily. The Monroe Doctrine combines the pursuit of hegemony with an aggressive anti-socialist ideology, aimed at the so-called Troika of tyranny, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, and with a new imperative of great power competition, pushing China, Russia, and Iran out of America's backyard. The removal of Maduro was the first application of the Monroe Doctrine. Cuba is meant to be next on the list. After cutting Cuba off from Venezuelan oil supplies, the Americans delivered another blow on January 30th. President Trump, acting under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, designated Cuba as an unusual and extraordinary threat to US national security. This opened the way for retaliatory tariffs against any country that dared to supply the island with fuel. Mexico, which after the cutoff of Venezuelan deliveries remained the only serious alternative supplier, immediately halted exports. From that point on, Cuba was on its own. The Cubans do produce some oil, around 40,000 barrels a day, but this does not come close to covering daily demand, which is more than twice as high at roughly 100,000 barrels. Enforcement of the blockade was entrusted to the United States Coast Guard, which began turning back oil tankers headed for Cuba. One such case was the Greek tanker Ocean Mariner. As one might expect, the American blockade quickly led to hours-long blackouts and the paralysis of life on the island. The authorities introduced a series of drastic measures, closing schools and universities, imposing restrictions on public transport and hospitals, and shutting down parts of the public administration deemed non-essential. But none of this spared the country from physical shortages of oil and fuel or from mounting social protests. Cuban authorities admit the situation is dramatic and say they will accept oil and fuel deliveries from any country willing to help. But the American blockade has effectively scared off potential sellers. The only ship to deliver oil to Cuba since the blockade began was the Russian tanker Anatoly Kolodkin. That happened in late March, and the shipment amounted to around 730,000 barrels of oil, enough to cover Cuban demand for barely 1 week. The oil blockade is not a prelude to some future conflict. The noose around Havana is tightening right now. The Americans are pressuring the Cubans through instruments of economic coercion. The question is, what happens when economic pressure proves insufficient? That is when the US armed forces enter the stage. On May 20th, 2026, a carrier strike group led by the USS Nimitz entered the Caribbean Sea. It joined the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group, already operating in the region, which consists of 3 amphibious assault ships carrying the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, a marine formation specializing in amphibious landings and special operations. A few days before the Nimitz arrived, US Southern Command, the American command responsible for military operations in Latin America and the Caribbean, released a short video clip captioned with 3 words: lethal, precise, ready. The footage shows aircraft, helicopters, tanks, landing craft and infantry. The sequence ends with an aerial shot of Cuba. All of this is meant to build a narrative of American readiness for armed intervention and to serve as an additional instrument of pressure on the authorities in Havana. Another element of this game is American reconnaissance flights along the Cuban coasts. An analysis of Flight Radar 24 data showed that since May 11th, at least 5 P-8A Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft and 3 MQ-4C Triton surveillance drones have operated near the island, collecting intelligence on Cuba's military capabilities and the political leadership in Havana. All of them flew with their transponders turned on, allowing anyone to track their route in real time. This was deliberate. The Americans want the authorities in Havana to know that they are watching their every move. The Trump administration is carefully building a narrative that presents Cuba as a serious threat to US national security. At the core of that narrative is the issue of foreign intelligence facilities. There are as many as 18 known signals intelligence sites on the island. Most of them are operated by Cuban intelligence, but there are also 3 Chinese facilities and 2 Russian ones. The main Russian site is located in Lourdes, south of Havana. It is a Cold War-era facility that Moscow reactivated in 2014. The Chinese sites are newer and probably better equipped. The main one is located in Bejucal, also near Havana. China uses Bejucal to monitor, among other things, the missile launch facilities at Cape Canaveral, and the only US training range capable of simulating combat in the Taiwan Strait. Also located dangerously close are the headquarters of US Central Command, which oversees operations in the Middle East, and incidentally, the president's residence at Mar-a-Lago. It is worth noting that despite having such valuable facilities, Russia and China are trying to stay on the sidelines of the current confrontation between the United States and Cuba. True, in late March, the Russians sent the Anatoly Kowotkin tanker to the island, but this was a symbolic shipment, and one that Washington had in fact approved. Beijing is also in no rush to help, watching from a distance as Trump tests the limits of America's own backyard, and drawing lessons that may prove useful in the future over Taiwan. It is not difficult to see that in Cuba's case, the Americans are following a familiar playbook, one they had already used against Venezuela. Alongside economic and military pressure comes the targeting of country's political leadership. Just as the Americans accused Maduro of drug trafficking, Raúl Castro, the 94-year-old former president of Cuba and Fidel's brother, has been accused of murdering 4 American citizens. The case concerns a 1996 incident in which the Cuban Air Force shot down 2 civilian aircraft belonging to the exile charity Brothers to the Rescue. American prosecutors claim that Castro gave the order to shoot the planes down. Everything must have a legal basis. On Cuba's Day of Independence, which the country marks on May 20th, President Trump addressed the island's people in a special statement. Quote, "America will not tolerate a rogue state harboring hostile foreign military, intelligence and terror operations just 90 miles from the American homeland. And we will not rest until the people of Cuba once again have the freedom their forefathers fought so violently to establish over 100 years ago." The indictment and removal of Maduro sent a clear message to his socialist allies in Havana. This is our hemisphere, and those that destabilize it and threaten the United States will face consequences. Unquote. After the Venezuelan experience, the Cubans understand that it is better not to test whether Trump is bluffing. That is why Havana is signaling its readiness to make concessions. As early as April, it announced that more than 2,000 prisoners would be released from Cuban jails. In addition, in mid-May, a visit by CIA Director John Ratcliffe was arranged. He arrived in Havana, where he met with Cuba's Interior Minister and representatives of the security services. Also present at the meeting was Rodriguez Castro, Raúl's grandson. The Cubans tried to convince the CIA chief that the country posed no threat to America. Radcliffe, in turn, pressed for political and economic reforms in Cuba and demanded the closure of Russian and Chinese intelligence facilities operating on the island, while warning that the window for an agreement was slowly closing. It might therefore seem that the stage is set, and all the actors are already in position. The fuel embargo has pushed Cuba toward an economic abyss, and the forces the Americans have assembled in the region are sufficient to bring down the communist authorities in Havana. But the fundamental question remains open. What is Donald Trump's ultimate objective toward Cuba? There is no simple answer. Over the past few weeks, the American president has presented a range of different options at his disposal, without yet deciding which one he will ultimately choose. The first option is a full-scale invasion and occupation of the island, a repeat of the model familiar from Operation Just Cause, the 1989 intervention in Panama, when tens of thousands of American troops overthrew General Manuel Noriega. In theory, such an option is possible. Cuba's armed forces, once among the strongest in Latin America, have now shrunk to around 45,000 poorly equipped soldiers with neither a functioning navy nor an effective air force. But a full-scale invasion would carry enormous political and humanitarian risks. The fall of the Cuban regime would mean that responsibility for the island would pass to the Americans. In practice, the United States would become responsible for 10 million Cubans deprived of food, medicine, fuel, and electricity. Stabilizing the situation could take months, consuming major American military, political, and financial resources. President Trump, who has repeatedly criticized precisely this kind of stabilization mission, does not appear interested in taking full responsibility for Cuba, but he has other options on the table. The second option is to replicate the Venezuelan scenario. Using special forces, the Americans could capture Raúl Castro and bring him to the United States and stand trial for the 1996 downing of the two aircraft mentioned earlier. But this plan carries a serious and at the same time very prosaic risk. Castro is 94 years old and might simply not survive such an operation. If he died before being brought to the United States, the abduction would lose any real purpose. That is why a third option emerges. Again, a version of the Venezuelan scenario, but not the part involving Maduro's abduction. Rather, it would mean searching for a Cuban version of Delcy Rodriguez, someone from within the current regime who would nevertheless be willing to cooperate with the United States. From leaks in the American press, we know that Trump wants the current president and head of the Cuban Communist Party, Miguel Díaz-Canel, to step down. Trump believes he is too radical and would refuse to carry out free market economic reforms. So who, after Díaz-Canel's resignation, could play the role of Cuba's Delcy Rodriguez in this story? Paradoxically, the best candidates for that role are members of the Castro family itself, who still wield enormous influence inside the structures of power. The most serious candidate to become Cuba's version of Delcy Rodriguez appears to be Oscar Pérez Oliva Fraga, a 54-year-old engineer whose grandmother was the biological sister of Fidel and Raúl Castro. Pérez Oliva currently serves as a deputy prime minister and minister of foreign trade and investment. He has several qualities that make him attractive to Washington. He is a pragmatist and a technocrat, a supporter of broad economic reforms, and at the same time he is not burdened by the Castro name. In March 2026, he also announced the largest economic reform since 1959, allowing Cuban immigrants in the United States to invest in Cuba. It is worth noting that Pérez Oliva became a deputy in the National Assembly last December, which under Cuban law is a necessary condition for assuming the presidency. This may suggest that the ground for succession is already being prepared. Apart from Pérez Oliva, two other members of the Castro family also play an important role in the current game. The first is Rodriguez Castro, the 41-year-old grandson of Raúl Castro and head of his personal security detail, who for months has been the main negotiator between the Castro family and the US State Department. Raulito took part in talks with both Marco Rubio and John Ratcliffe. In recent weeks, Alejandro Castro Espin has also emerged from the shadows. Raul's only son, a 60-year-old brigadier general and former intelligence chief, who more than a decade ago successfully conducted talks with the Obama administration that ended a brief thaw. The Castro family remaining in power, even if only from the back seat, is, as one might imagine, not the dream scenario for nearly 3 million Cuban Americans. The Cuban diaspora built its political identity around the promise of regime change on the island, free elections, accountability for the communists, and the return of property seized after 1959. From their perspective, any deal with the Castros would simply be a betrayal. The Cuban diaspora has its representative inside the presidential administration. That one, of course, is Marco Rubio, who has tirelessly lobbied for an end of communist rule in Cuba. This is not only about the exile community in which Rubio grew up, but also about his own political ambitions. If Trump now strikes a deal with Havana, Rubio could lose the support of his ironclad electorate, Cuban Americans in Florida, and with it, his chances of becoming the next president of the United States. It is no secret that Rubio is one of the most serious Republican contenders for the White House in 2028. Rubio is by no means in a losing position on Cuba. Although the final decision, of course, belongs to the president, Rubio holds an exceptionally strong position inside the Trump administration, especially when it comes to Latin America. His chances of persuading the president to intervene in Cuba seem all the greater because, after the fiasco of the American-Israeli war with Iran, a short and victorious military campaign in the Caribbean could repair Trump's image and improve his approval ratings, especially since the Cuban army poses no real threat to the US military. The main risk of armed intervention is the need to assume responsibility for 10 million Cubans before their country is capable of standing on its own feet. Analysts are divided in their forecasts of Trump's next move toward Cuba. Some believe that, following the Venezuelan example, Trump will fight his Cuban Delcy Rodriguez and strike a deal with Havana. Others believe the opposite, that we will soon see the fall of Cuba's communists. The clue to Trump's next steps lies in the limits of the Donroe Doctrine. When he announced the new US national security strategy last year, President Trump promised the return of American dominance over the Western Hemisphere. But Trump never explained exactly how he intended to secure that dominance. The intervention in Venezuela showed that dominance can be achieved not only through regime change, but also through regime compliance. The fact that Trump abandoned regime change in Caracas does not mean he will do the same in Havana. There is, in fact, an interesting theory that casts the January events in Venezuela in a slightly different light. According to this theory, the idea to remove Maduro and strike a deal with Delcy Rodriguez came not from President Trump, but from Marco Rubio himself. Securing the compliance of the regime in Venezuela was supposed to be crucial to his plans for Cuba. The road to a free Havana runs through Caracas. For years, Venezuela was Cuba's economic and energy lifeline, and nothing has weakened the Cuban authorities more than cutting them off from Venezuelan oil and placing the island under a fuel blockade. If that theory is true, if everything that has happened since Maduro abduction was in fact engineered by Rubio, then we are not waiting for another Delcy Rodriguez. We are waiting for another generation of Rough Riders planting the American flag over the San Juan Heights.